I apologize that I don't have my fancy camera setup. I'm away from my studio, but was so eager to record this episode. And I should add a disclaimer that, and I never want to talk about this again, but I've been having a chronic skin issue for the last few months that I usually disguise with my lights. and, and so you're seeing me. I'm going to put some filters and stuff on this to make me look normal. But just if anyone was wondering why I look quite harsh on here, that's why. But anyway, enough of that. I'm here with.
Well, if this isn't you at your best, then shoot.
No, we all know statistically Americans are far better looking than the British with our crooked teeth and all of that. Poor skin complexions. But I'm here with Austin Fife, who wrote the Light and Truth letter. Austin, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Doing really well. Thanks for having me. I was really excited when I got the
Oh,
invitation.
it's my pleasure. I've been so excited for this too. And I guess we should begin. For those who don't know what the Light and Truth letter is, could you briefly explain what is it and why you wrote it?
Yeah, I've got a physical
Oh,
copy
brilliant.
here. Here's what it looks like: the Light and Truth letter. Um, I had never really anticipated it to be much of a published book. That was kind of a last minute thought that I had, was to publish a physical copy, because I figured some folks would appreciate something in their hands. And I've been shocked how many people have preferred having a physical copy. So it's free to read online at lightandtruthletter.org or .com. I have both of them. If you Google Light and Truth Letter, I mean, it's pretty much every search, including Reddit, where I have some folks who aren't big fans. But yeah, read it free online. Literally yesterday, I uploaded the Kindle version as well. I had a lot of people request that, so I've got the Kindle version up. Uh, but the Light and Truth Letter is the culmination of my 10-year faith journey. I had a faith crisis. A lot of people do. I don't know if I'm particularly unique. And so the Light and Truth letter is just the culmination of my faith journey and some of the questions that I asked as I debated leaving the church versus staying.
Hmm. It's I would say I've been reading it on the website, and it's really readable. It's definitely worth going and seeing, even if you aren't having a faith crisis per se. It's faith promoting wherever whatever level you're at. And are you seeing a good response to it? You mentioned that there are obviously critics, and you call out quite directly people who you know are the ones who propagate misleading narratives and things like that. But are you generally
hmm
seeing a good response to it?
Well, it's interesting too, the fact that I'm getting a lot of pushback from critics is in a way a compliment to me personally. I think if it were nonsense, if it were trash, I would imagine that critics would largely disregard it. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing them engage with it very seriously, even if they use nonsense arguments against the Light and Truth letter. That's an indication that there's something meaningful and tangible there. So that's one pocket. But I would say, by and large, the reception's been overwhelmingly positive. I confessed on a different podcast that half of me wanted this to flop. I have no desire to go on lots of podcasts and put my name and face out there. That's not a desire of mine. But what's in the Light and Truth letter is really important to me, and I hope it helps people. So I'll do whatever it takes. But I've been really surprised by its reception, largely overwhelmingly positive.
Have you had any examples you can share? It's fine if not, but of people coming to you afterwards and sharing how it's helped them.
So this has only been out 3
Yeah,
weeks,
yeah.
and I assumed this would happen. Uh, I assumed Here's what I thought would happen: is the faithful, believing members of the church would love it or like it, and then eventually the critics would grab hold of it and hate it. And what I was hoping is in time it would start reaching the people that I think that this may help. If you're a former member of the church who's left, and then there's just things you miss about the church, things you miss about your old community, things you miss about, having a living prophet or the Book of Mormon or anything that you miss, but you left, based on a narrative, then I hope the Light and Truth letter helps. If you're a faithful member, but having some concerns, having some doubts, I hope that the Light and Truth letter helps. And so what's happened is I think the critics got it first. I mean, it was getting blasted on Reddit like 2 days in. So that caught me up by surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, most of my traffic the first week was from Reddit, and largely negative. So the first week I was like, "Man, what did I do? This is a terrible idea." And it took me some time to kind of process. Go, actually, I think their really negative visceral reaction is likely a sign that it's actually perfect, or maybe not perfect, but it's going well. Um, but now 3 weeks in, I'm starting to get some of the feedback that I was hoping to get. So I've gotten lots of positive emails, "Love your letter. This is gonna help a lot of people." But now I'm starting to get, emails from people who are like, "I having a little bit of a faith crisis. Your, letter really helped." Or just yesterday on Facebook, somebody said, um, I used to be afraid of critics and antis, and now I feel a lot more confident.
That's brilliant.
There was a mom on Instagram who said every she said every, but parents need to read this to their children to help inoculate them. And so I'm starting to get some of that feedback, which is what I was hoping to get. And I hope over time it starts reaching more and more of the people that I think it'll most help.
And it's only been 3 weeks, so it's really cool to see the impact that it is having. Um, Now, I just want to. I would love for you to take us back to when you were in the midst of your kind of faith crisis, when you were questioning, and just share with us kind of the texture of your mind at the time. Like, I'm interested in kind of, did you have a critical inner voice when you were questioning? Because it's quite a. I guess I want to know, how can someone who's in that position now not catastrophize when they are having a faith crisis, or even, we call it crisis, which instantly rings alarm bells. Um,
Right.
how do we not catastrophize that and realize that it's okay to question in the midst of questioning?
Yeah. I actually almost finished a book about 2 years ago. And the reason I didn't finish it is it was really boring. It was like a long talk, and I knew that no one would read it. And so I never finished it. I probably will finish it and put it on like family search for my kids and grandkids. But in that book that I never finished, one thing I wrote about is uh, we need to reconceptualize a faith crisis. A crisis insinuates an urgent problem, right? You're having a heart attack, right? There's a crisis, and doubts and questions and concerns about the gospel. They're not. It's not a crisis. It's just doubts, questions, and concerns that you have. And so reconceptualizing, when you're questioning or you have concerns as a journey, I think is a really effective way. And it's kind of cliche, but I do think it's really valuable. A faith journey, faith quest, if call it whatever you want to call it, but because that sounds exciting. A journey sounds
Yeah,
fun. A crisis doesn't sound fun at all. Uh, and I think it's more accurate. One thing, in my opinion, critics want you to do is treat your concerns as a faith crisis, because crisis insinuates you need to fix this, you need to know this right now. And I think if you give that to the critics, then they win. And so instead of treating it like a crisis, treat it like a journey. I talk at the end of my book. I mean, it's a letter, but it's really a book, right? I mean, this thing's it's thick, right?
it's a big letter.
Yeah, it's a big letter. Yeah. I talk at the end about the faith scale, where on my faith scale to this day, I have things that my scale of belief and my scale of doubt, right? And over the years, they've done this. Um, and so when I have a question or concern, perhaps I put a few marbles or pebbles on the doubt scale. It doesn't mean it does this,
Mm.
right? It's not a crisis. It's just, I have all these reasons for belief, and oh, you know what? I don't know the answer to that one specific question. So I'm going to put it on my scale, and it's going to be something that I'm going to think about. And sometimes I get answers reading the scriptures. Sometimes I get answers just through experience. There's something that I learn as I get older that answers a question for me. And so treating, your quest for knowledge and faith as a journey as opposed to a crisis, I think is a wonderful way of reframing what you're feeling if you're going through something. And it's not to take away, it's difficult. Going through what we traditionally call a faith crisis, it's very challenging, it's very hard. So I don't want to minimize that because it's painful and it hurts. But again, a journey sounds a lot more fun than a crisis.
Absolutely, it's all about the story we tell ourselves, right? It's like the some of the podcasters that I work for. They often talk about the analogy of being in a gym and you get your heart pounding, and if that was in the context of the gym, that is completely normal. But if that happened, if you were just sat on the couch, you'd be terrified. And it's like, but
Right.
then as we frame it differently, as we frame things differently, it just shows the power. What it's interesting actually. I wasn't going to say this, but hearing you makes me realize that actually the kind of framing it as a catastrophe, as a crisis, kind of justifies a lot of these critics' goals, which is to say, get you into a coaching program for deconstruction and all of the things that you would only naturally do if you thought, man, this is a huge deal and all of this. But what's the what's
Well, and they want to ask you questions and they want you to answer them right now.
hmm,
And if you give that to critics, then they win, right? And so that's why I think it's really important to reframe it as something more patient, something more like a journey. Because if you give that to them, this is a crisis and you need to solve this right now. Well, there's just some things you can't Google.
hmm.
Some things take experience, they take wisdom, they take time, they take temperance, and so yeah, I use faith crisis in the book because everyone knows what I mean when I say that. But I personally an advocate of faith journey or something that frames it more positively because it's not a crisis.
I love that. What's one thing you would, if you could go back in time and tell your past self one thing, what would that be during the heat of that?
I would just what I said, that you can take your time. There's no rush on this. If you've read any part of the Light and Truth letter, you know that I came to my wife, and I basically did not believe in God anymore. I mean, it was pretty much as close to a done deal for me as
Mm,
anything. I told my wife I don't think that I believe in a God, but I pretty much didn't believe. And as I talked about in the letter, she didn't panic. She didn't get defensive. She thought for a moment when I confessed her that I no longer believed. And she said that she is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because this is where she's found the most light and truth. And if you can find more light and truth outside the Church of Jesus Christ, I will follow you. And she had 100% meant it. And so and she reframed what I was feeling as the start of a journey. She was like really excited for me. She said, "You're going to be asking the real questions because you're building your testimony from the ground up." So she was like jealous of my faith journey because she knew I was going to be asking some really core, challenging questions, and I was going to learn something and come out on the other side. Who knows in what condition, but different and hopefully better. And she was excited to see that change. And so I don't know what I would tell myself. I think I had an awesome wife who, framed it as if you can find something better, then let's do that. And that really helped me because I couldn't just ask a bunch of questions and then run away. I couldn't just say, well, I don't believe in God. and then not provide our family with something, with a better or different alternative. And so that really helped me. So I don't know what I would do different, but maybe give myself a big hug and say it'll be okay
No,
or something. I'm not sure.
I absolutely love that though, and we're seeing this recurring theme in our conversation of reconceptualizing what it is to question, what it is to have a faith experience, and it seems like in so many other ways as well as this, curiosity and adventure is such an antidote to anxiety and worry about these
Yeah.
things and so many other things. I found that too when I'm worried about something. If I step outside of it and approach it with curiosity and reason and think, okay, we can actually, as your wife advised you, we can go on an adventure here. We can really figure things out. And
Yeah.
I love that framing. Now, we're going to revisit later your wife's response because I think for me that was one of the most important things in the whole letter. But I want to dive into some of the specifics first, and I would love for you to share with us
Sure.
some of the key manipulation tactics that you were seeing from critics, and I guess how you've seen these tactics affect real people in real time.
Yeah. Um, in the Light and Truth letter, it's the very first section of the Light and Truth letter is manipulation and lost an earphone. Is manipulation and fallacies. Uh, I was listening to a podcast earlier this year, and in the podcast, they were talking confidently about, there's this anti-Mormon literature, and there's plenty of resources out there for questioning members, and so you don't have to be afraid of anti-Mormon literature. And I agree, but frankly, I was a little bit concerned. Uh, because I'm aware of the tactics that critics use to explain history and facts, I wasn't confident that somebody could go in and read anti Mormon literature and then come out unscathed, not because of the data and facts and history. The data, facts, and history are rather innocuous just on their own. If they were just sitting on the table, um, I don't think anyone in particular would be particularly perturbed, but it's the narrative that critics use. It's like, I don't know, like a little round ball or something, a metal ball. By itself, it's nothing. I mean, it's not going to hurt anyone, but launched at you at 1,300 miles per hour, that could really
Mm,
hurt. So it's the narrative, not the facts and history, that's damaging. And so when I was listening to this podcast, I felt really concerned because I felt like I couldn't tell my loved ones, my kids, oh yeah, just go look at anti-Mormon material, and then here's some faithful resources and you'll be a-okay, because I knew that critics are using manipulative techniques to explain their points. And so I felt I had this impression. I was like, I wish there was something out there, like a letter, like written to the critics about like concerns that somebody had when they were trying to leave the church, and things that they noticed that critics use, techniques that critics use when they tried to explain facts and history. And it took me about a week of thinking about that. I'm like, I think I got to write this thing.
mm,
um, I don't know if I'm the only one in the world, but uh, it's not out there yet, and I think our people need this. They need something to inoculate our youth before they run into anti-Mormon literature, not just a patch-up job after they've been after their testimonies have been decimated. And so that's been one of the pieces of feedback, is like, I'm going to read this with my kids, which has been really honoring, because that's largely who I was thinking of. I
right.
was thinking, I want to help my kids use some critical thinking skills, um, so that when they encounter information from critics, that they're able to take it and see what critics are doing, and then walk out unscathed. It's not to say all critics everywhere are nasty, terrible, awful people, right? It's not to say they never bring up any good points ever. That's not what I'm saying either. Um, Going back to what you said earlier, to this day, I'll hear something from critics and I'm like, oh, interesting. I've never thought of that. Huh. And then I put it on my little scale, right? Uh, I literally treat it like an adventure. It's like this fascinating search quest. It's like, oh, interesting. That's a good point, XYZ critic. I'm going to think about that some more. And I do this to this day all the time. I hear stuff. I'm like, oh, interesting. I've never heard that theory or thought of it from that angle. That's really interesting to me. I'm gonna think about that a bit more.
And what would you say is the most common, if there is one, most common tactic that, because you wrote that list, and I'm wondering if you could
Oh,
say give an example of one of the most common ones that you've seen from that.
yeah. The one that had the most impact on me, like the biggest aha moment for me, was false compromise,
Okay.
where you present the fallacy is let's say there's some position that you own that's here, or that you believe in, or that that's here, and then somebody presents, I mean, polar opposite, like couldn't be any more extreme of a narrative here, and so you have opposing premises. We naturally, as humans, we take the middle ground, right? If there's the large cup, the small cup, we take the medium cup, right? We if there's the large package, the small package, we take the medium one, right? We naturally do this as humans, and so critics take advantage of this desire we have as humans to compromise between two extremes. But the problem is that if this is true and this is false, the truth isn't here.
Right. Yeah.
The middle
Yeah.
ground between the middle ground between truth and lie is not truth. And so that was one of the most impactful things that I learned is Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Joseph Smith was a fraud, sex crazed, treasure digging, guy, right? Um, the middle ground between those two is not where the truth is. And so
Right.
that, I think, that was one of my biggest things that I've learned over the years is not to succumb to the false compromise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny because this is what's so helpful about the letter is that when you read that, I read that list, as I did the whole book. But that list in particular, it just kind of it makes so much sense. You read it and you're like, oh yeah, yeah, because you think like you have to intellectually grapple when you come up with when you see an issue presented to you
Right.
and think, oh man, I've got to come up with a really smart answer for this, or I've got to really go to my scriptures. But then actually, the premise itself is the issue, not the narrative itself is the issue, not the substance of the narrative.
Right.
Um, so
Yeah, and that's what I hope will be one of the takeaways is because when you hear something that goes against what you know and what you believe, it's uncomfortable, right? It's like you feel kind of unsettled when you hear something unflattering that's against what you have largely heard or known. Doesn't mean what you're hearing is wrong, right? It just when you start to get this uncomfortable feeling, maybe pull out the list of manipulation and fallacies and see if you can find it.
mhm.
And what you'll find is more often than not, you're going to find it somewhere in there. Another common one is meat before milk, where off this is, I think, more common among like Christian anti-Mormons. Well, they'll present complicated doctrinal issues without establishing the fundamental building blocks,
Oh
right?
man, I get that
Uh,
so as someone who lives in a
right.
place where there are not many Latter-day Saints around me, I get that so much. Almost every week, I get something like that.
Yeah. So if someone comes up to you and says, "So you're going to have your own planet and be a god one day,"
Yeah,
you could start pulling out scriptures all you want, and you could start like, well, actually, if you start a sentence with well actually, then you're playing defense, you're on the ropes, they're punching you and you're just falling back. But hopefully, if you can just look at this table and go, oh, I see what they're doing.
yeah.
They're presenting meat before milk, and that is a manipulation technique. Or uh, the LDS church is super abusive and it destroys people's lives, right? That's an appeal to emotion. And so I think giving something a name is really powerful. When we can't name something, then it has a lot more power over us. But if we can say, they said this, here's what they're doing, that gives a lot of clarity, so that, okay, maybe they said something that's true, but with like a really, like they talked about seer stones, but they gave just like the most unflattering, least generous narrative possible. Okay, you can kind of look that up. You could say, oh, okay, this is what they're doing. It's not the seer stones that are the problem. It's the narrative, right? The premise, the presupposition, the assumptions built into the way they're presenting this information. That's the actual problem. It's the delivery.
Yeah, well, that's the power of memes today, right? Is you articulate something into a way that it is so easily shared, and it's
Right.
relatable. And so what you've effectively done is you've memed into existence all these different tactics, so that we can say, instead of, you know, getting annoyed by some issue and thinking, man, actually that's I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, you can then remember these tactics. So it's a really great toolkit. And it's like, I mean,
Well, the internet is primed for anti-Mormon
yeah,
content.
yeah.
The internet was the best thing that could have ever happened to anti-Mormons, because, like you said, you could just meme something and then run away, right? You have no desire to actually know the truth, to actually know the narrative, to actually know the history, and it's like one sentence from a critic could take an entire like fair Mormon conference or fair Latter-day Saint or TED talk to answer, or like an entire book to answer this one line. So that's what critics do, is they lob out just a gish gallop of bombs of all these different unanswerable questions, and then we as Latter-day Saints, we have sat back and then we try to approach it academically.
Hmm.
We pull out the scriptures, we're pulling out the Joseph Smith papers, church history, and we're trying to like sincerely answer. But they didn't ask a question sincerely. Uh, they asked it from a place of manipulation and propaganda. And so I think by being able to label what they're doing, I think that's really powerful. And like I said, the internet's, I say in the book, but Taco Bell, if you want to know what time Taco Bell closes, Google's great. Google's awesome for that. Um, but if you want to know which political party to vote for, should you be pro Palestine, pro Israel? Yikes.
Yeah.
It, anything controversial, remotely controversial, the internet is just a minefield of misinformation and disinformation. And so material critical to the church is falls into the same category. It's not as simple as you just Google something and then you get your answer, right? It's a controversial issue. So the internet's full of misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this isn't unusual as well. This isn't unique to this, in that, you know, there's this really powerful therapy tool, when you're dealing with, you know, well, they call them cognitive distortions. And so if you are one that is prone to generalization in your thoughts, or catastrophizing in your thoughts, you can write down a thought you're having in one column. You can recognize which cognitive distortion you're going through. You know, everyone hates me. That's, you know, an absolute or generalization or catastrophization. And then once you've recognized that
Right.
tool, that cognitive distortion, you reframe it to be more accurate. And you learn over time to be able to just naturally do that without consciously sitting down and doing it. And it's a powerful tool, and it's this same principle of getting to the actual truth of it, not just the excitement and the emotion that is packaging it. But your your meat and milk example, I have this funny example that when I was trying to be a good missionary in England in college, and my friend, who, you know, everyone knew that I was Christian, and said, "What are you doing at the weekend?" And I said, "I'm actually going down to the temple. There's a temple in London where we go, and it's a really sacred place, and it's very important to me, and I can kind of perform religious ceremonies similar to how I would at church." And he was really intrigued by it. And then he Googled right there at the table, London Temple. And the first thing that came up on Google was temple garments. And you saw this white,
Right.
and then he looked
Yeah.
over to me, and hanging out of my t-shirt just slightly was this white t-shirt, and his face just went,
Yeah.
what? And you know, he was really taken aback, and it was that whole meat before milk of saying, well, take a few steps back, and he was like, what on earth is going on? Um, so that so
Yeah.
we see the power of these things, these different tactics. But um, what are you seeing from your research and from your own experience? What are right now the key issues that people are grappling with and trying to get answers for, and how would you advise people to approach these honest questions
Yeah.
with in a way that is faith promoting?
So I'm going to answer your second question
Sure.
first, and then probably forget your first question. But
Key issues.
one advantage that, yeah, one advantage that we have in the church is that the evidence is on our side. So, for example, when we talk about where did the Book of Mormon come from, we have a Book of Mormon. There was a date of publication. We have, the actual book. There's a translator, or if you're a critic, there's a writer of the book. It actually exists. Uh, Critics, and the book it's beautiful. There's beautiful allegories, sermons. It's complex. It has Hebraisms, like it. So the Book of Mormon exists, whereas critics only have contradictory theories because they don't believe that the Book of Mormon is divinely not even inspired. They don't believe the Book of Mormon is divinely mandated, that it came from God. They have to reverse engineer. Okay, well, we have the Book of Mormon, so how do we have it? And when you start reverse engineering all the complexities of the Book of Mormon, just the theory you come up with, it looks sillier and sillier and sillier, and ends up just being really contradictory. So we're, as members of the church, we're in a position of strength because we actually have the Book of Mormon. It actually exists. Whereas, critics, I mean, historians concede that, there was metal plates, right? Uh, Maybe they don't believe that they came from the angel Moroni, but they can see that there were metal plates that, witnesses saw and handled. They concede, or at least sincere critics concede that. And so then you have to come up with, okay, so Joseph Smith, in between XYZ thing, he was making metal plates and etching characters. Okay, that's a theory, but there's no negative evidence to support that. There wasn't somebody who saw Joseph Smith uh, working metal plates or etching characters. Um, and so we're in a position of strength because we actually have the Book of Mormon, whereas they only have theories with no supporting evidence. And so anytime you hear something related to kind of early church history, particularly with the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, your counter question to any question they ask is, do you have any evidence for your theory? Because if they have no evidence, then what are we even talking about? And so that's one position of strength that we have. The other, when it comes to like fruits of the church, and this is where more I'm going to get back to your question, like what are like the hot topic problems that critics talk about. I think most of them revolve around the fruits of the church: LGBTQ issues, women in the church, abuse in the church, uh, toxic masculinity, right? These are some of the more hot topic issues right now. Polygamy, another one. Um, and another area of strength that we have is that the church is really good at helping people. Uh, the fruits of the church, I mean, it's like overwhelming. Church members live longer, they're healthier, they have less divorce, there's less abuse among church members, there's less poverty, they're better off socioeconomically, more education. I mean, just like of the objective things that you can measure, Latter day Saints are doing really well. And this is data in out of the church spanning decades. So it's basically irrefutable that members of the church are doing really well. And so the way critics combat that is with anecdotal experiences.
Mm.
Well, it's the church didn't work for me, or my ward was super judgy, or my bishop was a real jerk, or didn't do enough to prevent abuse, or on and on and on. And so that's another area of strength that we have is the data is on our side. All that they have is anecdotal personal experiences. So that's one of my other questions I always ask is beyond anecdotal experiences, do you have any data to back up what you're saying? You know, the church is abusive or harmful to women, or name the thing that people accuse the church of. Just ask them, do you have any data to support what you're saying beyond just anecdotal experience? And the answer is largely going to be no. And so, what are kind of the big issues? It's kind of in the second half of my letter. I address women in the church, polygamy, masculinity, LGBTQ plus issues. I'm sure I'm missing some. I could pull out my table of contents, but uh,
Essentially, it's
church finances, right? Those are some of, I think, the more hot topics relevant today.
it seems like most of them, though, apart from a few unique ones like polygamy, for example, are the same issues that all major Christian organizations in the world are, are trying to grapple with to different extents. You know, how to live as a traditional kind of Orthodox Christian in a modern, more secular world. And I wonder, in your writing of the book, and you did an incredible amount of research. Something I love is that every section you have almost as much as there is writing content, there are footnotes with sources, and I think that's really important. But were there any times where there was tension between um, your spiritual conviction and intellectual rigor and reason?
Yeah, one area I assumed that um, there's a bunch of studies that show that like Latter Day Saint teens in particular, there's less delinquency. Um, and I just kind of assumed Latter Day Saint communities are safer. They're a safer place to be. That was kind of an assumption I had, and I couldn't really find data to support that. I don't know if that means that it's more dangerous. I just couldn't really find solid data to support that Latter Day Saint communities are safer. There's some supporting ideas that support that premise, like less delinquency among our young adults and teens, but I didn't quite see it fleshed out cleanly the way I thought. So it's not something I cover in the letter because I could not find the data to support that. And so I'm sure there's others. That's just the first one that I thought of.
Right, I see. I see. Well, that's interesting. No, it's I think I think your temperament is perfect for this kind of role that you've taken upon yourself, and that you've said previously you felt called to, because um, that kind of tendency towards jumping in and wanting to, defend and do this, you actually seem to approach it in a very calm manner, and I almost think, I mean, I may be wrong, but because of your unique experience going through a faith crisis, and kind of almost being at the point where it was like, I'm not, I don't really believe in this anymore, led you to maybe not having as much of a bias as, say, perhaps I would if I was thinking I'm going to write this letter to combat this. And so I think that's really interesting to observe.
Yeah, little peek behind the curtain. I am. My wife calls me radically independent when it comes to political how I vote.
Right.
I voted for uh, it might literally be 50-50 how I voted in the US Democrat and Republican. Uh, almost every election, I don't do it on purpose. It's not like, okay, half Republican, half Democrat, or independent, or whatever. Um, but no one is without bias. I certainly am, but I do have a temperament of like when critics say something, this is why I would be a terrible debater. I really would, because a critic would say, "Well, how do you explain X, Y, Z?" I'd go, "Huh, I never thought about that. That's interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that." And that's kind of my approach. Like I don't get really defensive and say, "Well, you're wrong because of this." That's just not my temperament. And so I would be a lousy debater, because when somebody says something that goes against my beliefs, I treat it with a lot of curiosity. I'm like, "Oh, interesting. Huh, I never thought of it that way. That's an interesting perspective." In fact, this might be a tangent, but I was reading, this is months ago, I was reading something on Reddit about somebody was really weirded out by the church, because so they're not I mean they probably removed their records or something, and they had an aunt who was not active, hadn't been active in years, lived a very different lifestyle, and then the aunt passed away, and then for the funeral, she was dressed in her temple robes and temple garb, even though she was like not at all an active member, was living a very different lifestyle. And this individual who had removed their records, was antagonistic toward the church, was really bothered and really offended that the church had the audacity to put, her aunt in temple clothes. And she was really weirded out by that. When I read that, I was like, huh, man, that is kind of weird. And I had like a lot of empathy and sympathy for this woman and that experience. And I thought about that literally for weeks. And it was like 2 months later in our ward, there was a woman who's not active, who has a daughter who's not active, who lives in a completely different city and county. And the daughter passed away. And so the mother wanted to hold a funeral service. And so we held a funeral service for her. And I was there setting up chairs and tables with my kids because my wife had an obligation. So I've got my 4 little kids, like setting up tables and chairs. The Relief Society catered a whole meal. Like the whole ward got together to help a less active woman's less active daughter who didn't even live anywhere close to put on like a funeral service. And it wasn't until then I got my answer, and I was just like, how ungrateful do you need to be offended by our religious observance, right? The members in whatever ward that was that your aunt lived in got together, pooled resources, dedicated their time, their talents, their efforts to put on a funeral service for your aunt. And this is your takeaway. And so
Mm.
this thing that I was like, huh, interesting. I could totally see why you'd feel that way. Turned into like all of a sudden I'm now like flipped. I'm like, you were wrong, miss. And deeply ungrateful. And you're I wrote a children's book called Cherries Never Grow about 2 children who just love cherries. They eat cherry. I mean, their faces are stained with cherry juice, and they could eat cherries at every single meal. They love it. But then one of the kids scratches his knee, one climbing the tree, and uh, the other kid is really annoyed that the tree casts such a long shadow, so they can't grow, vegetables. And they get annoyed about all these things about the tree, so they end up cutting down the tree because they're so annoyed by it. And then, predictably, the last page, they're both sobbing because now cherries never grow. And so uh, that's my way of teaching perhaps the light and truth letter to children is don't cut down the cherry tree. There's certainly problems in the church, in church history. There's weird stuff. One of the dangers is being a group, right? As soon as you get together as a group, then you start having problems because people are weird, and they make mistakes, or big mistakes, like they're really wrong. And we're supposed to like have these wards get together and a whole global church and do something meaningful. Well, we're going to make mistakes, and big ones too, not just small ones. I don't want to minimize somebody's experience with abuse or anything else, but you can't curse the tree and then chop it down and expect it to still bear fruit. So that was a long tangent. I don't know if there's anything good in there, but was that interesting or helpful? I don't know.
It was perfect. No, it was really interesting, and it's a great analogy. And a question that I've wanted to ask you, Austin, is if you had any experiences of personal revelation while writing the letter, and what role the Spirit played in this. As it is very academic, but I'm sure there must have been some cool experiences and quite transformative ones while
Yeah.
writing it.
While writing the polygamy section.
Interesting, right?
Well, that was the most revelatory experience that I had. Um, while writing the Light and Truth letter, I had a bunch of revelatory experiences. Like I would listen to a podcast. I'm like, oh, interesting. And then I'd go to the letter, and it's literally like the section that I'm editing has something to do with that, right? There's little things like that. That's just fun. I mean, it was just interesting and fun. But polygamy, it's its own section, or plural marriage is how I say it in the letter. Plural marriage. It was a subsection under other. So it was kind of like the small little thing. And I had asked about 10 friends and family to read the Light and Truth letter back in June. And I asked them, give me feedback, tell me what's working, what's not, or, spelling mistakes and that sort of thing. And it was like maybe end of July. I mean, literally, I've told everyone my cutoff is, I don't know what Sunday, but like last chance to submit your, recommendations or things that you would change, that sort of thing. And so it was done. Cutoff was over. And then I got a call 2 days later from my brother and sister-in-law, and they expressed how they felt like I needed to talk more about polygamy than I do in plural marriage. And
Right.
they didn't really tell me, here's what you should do. They just said, this was a real concern for me, or, my sister. And so we want you to talk more about this. And I had like nothing. It's like, I don't know. I don't know what more I could say. And so I talked to my wife that night, and we were kind of going back and forth on it. And she said, sounds like you need a testimony of polygamy. That was what she said.
Oh, interesting.
After we went back and forth, said, sounds like you need a testimony of polygamy. And I still was kind of resistant, because my deadline was done. I was going to publish it. And then the next day I brought my laptop to work, and I go, okay. And then during my lunch break, it was the most revelatory 1 hour experience that I had writing the Light and Truth letter. And it was like a one shot, very few edits. And then I sent it to my wife. And when we came home, I mean, we were both in tears, basically, because it just, as it came out, it was revelatory. And I've already seen some people notice. I don't back away from polygamy. I'm not a polygamy apologist, or excuse me, not in that sense, but I don't apologize for polygamy. Anyway, so I would say that was the most specifically revelatory experience I had writing the Light and Truth letter.
No, that's fascinating. That's a really interesting experience, and your wife seems to prop up quite a lot in these experiences you share, and she
Did
sounds
you
amazing
notice?
by the sound. Yeah. No, she sounds amazing, and I'm inspired by her example at the offset as well, of encouraging you, when and not responding with confrontation and worry, but with faith and hope, and inspiring you. And it led me, as I pondered that, to thinking about people in my life who I would love to help in their faith journey. And, we can't help everyone. Some people don't want to be helped. But say I've had some experiences recently where at a family event, or if I've been driving someone close to me and they've started having a go at me about the Book of Mormon, and like do you not know that it's not a historical record? Or we're at a family event and there's that one family member who just makes things awkward because they've, you know, had their own experience, and that's totally fine. That's caused them to leave the church, but they just want to keep bringing it up and making these conversations awkward. And I guess what would be your advice for actually having gone through that, actually helping a family member who we care for without kind of getting into awkward arguments about specific doctrine and or you know, doing things that don't help, you know?
Yeah, I wrote in the epilogue. So I've already finished the Light and Truth letter. It's over. Now I have an epilogue with just like additional resources and sources, and then I have this letter that I titled "A Letter to a Former Member of the Church of Jesus Christ." It's not that long. I think I'll read it for you and your audience.
Yeah, yeah.
Dear blank. As I publish the Light and Truth letter, I want you to know that it was not written about you. I know you are not trying to destroy the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I know you have a balanced perspective on how the church helped you. After my own intensive research, I honestly do not blame anyone for not being completely convinced of the Restoration's truth claims. The evidence is convincing to me, but it certainly isn't irrefutable. As you decided what to believe, I know parts of this letter may be uncomfortable for you. That wasn't my intention. I know that you were personally injured at the hands of insensitive church leaders, and I'm sorry that happened. I don't know why the gospel did not work for you. I wish it had. The kingdom rolls on, but let me say that we, as a church, miss you. We were better when you were with us. There is a U-size hole among our ranks. Over the years, we have benefited so much from your gifts and talents, and we miss them. Most of all, we and I miss you. We can always spend time together in other ways, but it won't be the same for me, and that's okay. If returning to the fold is not in the cards, I very much hope that you are happier outside the church. If you do not believe in God, I sincerely desire that you find life, love, and purpose without the gospel. Regardless of our differences, you have all my love and respect. All the best, Austin Fife.
Yeah.
And so I think empathy, understanding, they encountered the same information you have and they came to a different conclusion. That's okay. Um, I wish people didn't leave the church. I wish people stayed, but they do. They always have. People have always left the church. It seems anecdotally more recently. I think that will change over time as we inoculate our youth. But regardless, people leave the church, and that's okay. And we can and should hope the very best for them. I genuinely do. I hope if somebody's left the church that the odds are stacked against them, right? The church is incredible at helping people and giving them uh, maximizing their opportunities when it comes to all these different things that the church helps. And so I genuinely wish the best for them, and I hope that their leaving the church doesn't negatively affect them. And we as members, we get kind of defensive. It's you know you're leaving the thing that I love, that I know that it's true, and you're wrong and I'm right, and it's like easy to get defensive. But I just only feel love. I I hope that things go really well for them, and I hope that they're happier outside the church. On Reddit, uh, I didn't start it. Somebody posted about the toxic masculinity mini section in the Light and Truth letter. And all the Redditors were commenting how the church is so bad. And that's not true, but they're just commenting how terrible the church is. And then somebody said something like, I'm a way better father and husband after I left the church. I'm X, Y, and they going on and on about why they're so much better. And I just respond, I'm like, I'm glad. I'm actually really glad. If you were a terrible person in the church and you left and you became a better person, I'm really happy that that's the case. Uh, and then the follow-up question is, do you have any data to support your theory beyond anecdotal experience? But I'm glad that you personally are not as toxic or not as bad. That's, I think, largely not the case for most people. But I'm glad for you leaving the church as a positive. So that's my reaction. I don't feel defensive. I don't panic. I get it. I get why people leave. I understand. The evidence is really compelling to me, but it's not like irrefutable, uh, without any what beyond a reasonable doubt, right? There's a preponderance of evidence for the church, but again, not beyond reasonable doubt. And so I understand why people leave. It doesn't bother me, but it does bother me when people leave based on false narratives and half truths, which is why I wrote the Light and Truth letter.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a really good point. And I think something that's going on at the moment that I'd love your take on is that certainly me, I can't speak for everyone, but I know many of us who feel frustrated and disheartened at the velocity of kind of media at the moment. That for my friends who are not of our faith and don't really know much about it, they kind of look at me and kind of like, why would you be a part of that? Because we see things like this new show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. We see Under the Banner of Heaven. We see these
Right.
media portrayals that are just like, especially as a British Latter-day Saint. I mean, if they want to come and film a
It's
documentary
rough
about our
out there.
life, it's well, it's just like my life is boring. It's got nothing to do with what they think that what the media probably thinks I'm up to as a member of the church. But I
Right.
think the velocity at which it's coming now is becoming quite disheartening when I have people who I look up to and respect messaging me when they hear something on the news, and it's like, is this really what you do? And it's like, oh man, how do
Right.
I explain this one and kind of get back to the level of respect that they used to have for me? How do you have any thoughts on combating those feelings and overcoming the
Yeah.
that?
So there are two parts or halves of my testimony. There's the heart. I talk about the head and the heart. There's the heart. That's like my spiritual testimony, right? My experiences with the divine that I cannot explain through natural means. And that's an important, sacred part of my testimony. That's not really the part of my testimony I talk about in the Light and Truth letter, because that's one of the pieces of feedback I've gotten is, just tell people to pray and ask God, and that's it. And I don't disagree, but the problem is if we're unable to provide rational answers for why we believe, then we're not going to be in an environment in which belief can flourish. Austin Farrar, and so we have to provide rational defenses. So for me, I have kind of two halves of my testimony. I have my spiritual heart side of my testimony, and that's important and sacred. I don't really talk about in the letter. For me, I mostly focus on the head, the rational, logical part of my testimony. And for
Mhm.
me, it is so unbelievably rational to be a member of the church. It's a very pragmatic thing. Again, live 7 years longer, uh, reduce my chance of divorce, give my kids a better upbringing than they would otherwise, have a stable identity through time to support me and my children for better mental health, and um, and the list goes on and on and on. I mean, I could just keep going. So being a member of the church is a very rational thing to do, even if you didn't believe it at all. There are a ton of people who are members of the church who don't believe it at all, but they want to raise their kids in the church. Online, the adage is PMO. It's physically in, mentally out, is what
Oh
it's called.
wow.
If you've ever heard that,
No, I
oh,
haven't.
it's a Reddit thing. Yeah, people will say, "I'm a PMO," and then they'll go and tell their story about something their bishop said that they didn't like or whatever, and so this is like I think, so being a member of the church is a very rational thing from a pragmatic point of view. Like, it's a very good place to raise a family, it's a very good place to help you, to be part of a community. Loneliness is a global epidemic. Uh, Loneliness kills far more people than other types of like physical ailments and diseases. People who are lonely die much quicker. They're much more miserable. The list goes on and on and on. We have this cohesive worldwide community, and we're all working towards something it's very healthy for us. uh, People debate, like, did Jonah actually get swallowed by a whale, right? Did that literally happen? But the story itself is an archetype that teaches something really important and something that's true. So whether it literally happened or not, does that make the story any less true? Right. These are the sorts of things that I think about with the logical side, the rational side of my brain. And I'm a full-fledged, unapologetic believer on both sides of my testimony: the rational, logical,
Mhm.
pragmatic side, but also the spiritual heart side of my testimony. And so when people are, why would you ever be part of this church? Like, it's a cult, or you're weird, or whatever the case is. Just like, live longer, don't get divorced, happier marriage, better sex. Married people have better sex than people who are not, who don't. Um, like, the list of benefits goes on and on and on. It's like, why would you not want to be a member of the church? That's my question.
Yeah, well, I think that's the beauty of the Light and Truth letter, is it effectively reframes, truthfully, not just effectively, truthfully, reframes a lot of distorted thinking, I think, around, it's correcting the framework for thinking about it, which I think is really, really helpful and goes a long way, rather than just answering a question, which it satisfies that, but it also goes beyond that, which is why I think it's catching on and helping so many people. And I think a key thing before we finish, is kind of a conclusion, is that you end it, or kind of the last big topic that you talk about, is belief in God. And I really appreciated that after you read through this swathe of good information, and kind of equipping yourself with being able to feel confident, you bring it back to what really matters. And, is your foundation on Jesus Christ, the rock of your Redeemer? How is your belief in God? The closer we are to Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ, the easier all of this will be. And realistically, these, as you noted at the end, the opposite to this, and what critics are experiencing, is full-on atheism, which, is, so I'm glad that you brought it round to those key issues, and they're so important. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
And well, Austin, anything else you want to give our listeners? Um, Anything else you want to say to them before we finish this up? Your
Yeah.
final thoughts.
Yeah, to lean in what you said there at the end, the belief in God, the heart, is kind of like our trump card as members of the church. And some of the feedback I've gotten has been, you need to talk more about, Moroni's promise. And I deliberately don't, because there's a certain type of member that I'm trying to appeal to. I'm trying to talk to Austin 5-10 years ago. Um, and provide rational, logical reasons to be a believing member of the church. Belief in God and your spiritual experiences, they're trump cards. Uh, I think part of the problem is spiritual experiences. To me, it's like, I say this in the book, it's like you witnessed a world record being broken, but there were no other witnesses, there was no other footage, there's not an adjudicator. So only you know, and you can't prove it to anyone else. And so I very much believe that that's true. That my spiritual experiences, they're special, they're sacred to me. They're not a reason why someone else should believe. And so I don't focus on it in the Light and Truth letter. It doesn't make it any less important. And it doesn't make it any less important for you or your listeners. But if you're in a place where I was, where you're having serious concerns, serious doubts, and you're just not sure if you can believe, I hope that the Light and Truth letter gives you the space you need for belief, so that you can ultimately seek the real source of light and truth. Because it's not this, right? This is just some of my musings and thoughts. God is the ultimate source of light and truth. And you've asked him with real intent, with a sincere heart, I promise he will answer. But the reason I don't say that first is sometimes critics are able to, that's called bulverism. That's another common manipulation tactic where they poison the well. They say something like, well, the church just tells you to pray, or you can't trust church leaders. So they get you in a place where your prayers are ineffective because they've poisoned the well. And so I'm hoping to detox the water a bit so that then you can go to the source of light and truth with real intent and sincere heart.
Well, that's a really good mission and a great place to end, Austin. So thank you so much for coming on. And I will link the Light and Truth letter in the description, and would encourage everyone to go and watch it. And not only that, but I found myself already sending it to a few people and linking it to people just naturally, because it is so helpful. So thank you for what you've done there and created, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Benjamin.
See you later.
See ya. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching For All the Saints. This show needs your help to grow. Please like the video, comment your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think would enjoy it. Thank you.